So when Schopenhauer suggests that we should not always just act on our feelings alone, he's not making a terrible point, right? That sometimes we can be deceived by our feelings and we can act a little bit irrationally or against our better judgment. One of the kind of really difficult ethical situations, one might say, in terms of acting against nature is the idea of when one should commit self-sacrifice. Because Schopenhauer, right, one of the things that he's suggesting sometimes is that oftentimes we act in self-sacrifice when we shouldn't. For example, it is a natural behavior, I would probably say, that if we hear like a baby crying, and then if we see a car coming, right, and we see like that a baby is there in the middle of the road, that we risk our mortal life, right, to make sure we run into the road and pick up the baby and get it out of harm's way. That's a pretty natural human thing. If you don't try to rescue the baby in that situation, people will often say, well, you know, you're a terrible, horrible human being. But what Schopenhauer might contend is say, well, wait a minute. If that baby's probably going to die anyway, right, why should you make it so that both you and the baby die? That doesn't make sense. Or how about this situation? What if a parent, right, and this is a time when, there wasn't as much technology or social services. What if a parent sacrifices its life to save a child, but in so doing dooms the rest of its children to starvation, right? What Schopenhauer, when he says that, right, because the idea in this particular idea of Schopenhauer is that if a parent is the only one who can feed the children, and a parent, because of emotion, sacrifices himself or herself to save it like a drowning child, what he has indirectly done is by not using his reason and relying solely on instinct, he dooms them all to death because now he's not able to provide for the rest of the children, right? Schopenhauer, right, is trying to suggest that feelings, right, can dupe both our self-interest and reason. Right? And to some extent, Schopenhauer isn't entirely wrong, right? So when he talks about, don't just marry a woman for physical beauty, that seems like a pretty good idea. In other ways, some of the circumstances that Schopenhauer is using are pretty disgusting. I mean, most of us would say, look, if you don't understand why you would risk your life to save a baby, you're just a terrible human being, right? Because there's something deep, innate in us as human beings that seems to suggest, hey, of course you try to save the baby because that's the human innate, right? When we say innate, just to be clear, right? That means inborn, right? Something that's just part of our nature, regardless of where we come from, right? That's something that's just inborn that we're supposed to do. But in the case of Wolf Larsen, right, his arguments about sentiment and morality, right, he is simply trying to say that all of these feelings about right and wrong and beauty and goodness, right, Wolf Larsen has a completely different perspective, which is, well, what's in it for me, right? And how are these feelings supposed to help me? Because if Wolf Larsen, right, if he doesn't believe in the soul, right, he believes in no God, no soul, no reward, right? It's just dog eats dog, yeast eating yeast, right? Then he says, what's the whole point of goodness, right? If the belief in goodness leads me to sacrificing my life and losing the only life that I'll ever have, then that sense of goodness is actually a trick to get me for sacrificing my life for someone else, right? In that sense, he thinks that feelings, right, are oftentimes a trick to make us behave in ways that go counter our own self-interests. And Wolf Larsen has none of that, right? His idea is that the idea of goodness is the abandonment of self-loyalty, right? Right? Wolf Larsen is just about surviving and looking out for number one. And he says any ideas of beauty and sentiment and things, right? He suggests that they are just fools who use these ideas of heaven and goodness and immortality in order to disguise from themselves the idea that they're afraid of death and they don't want to believe that this life is all they have, right? This idea is most famously put forward by Sigmund Freud in a very famous book called The Future of an Illusion. In Freud's Future of an Illusion, right, Freud is a famous, he's kind of the founder of modern psychology, even though most of his ideas have been discredited. The Future of an Illusion, he basically says that religion and sentimentality and all of these different ideas about heaven and reward and afterlife, basically what Freud suggests is these are lies that people tell themselves in order to overcome their own fear of death. People are naturally afraid of death, and so they create systems of morality that both serve kind of the greater society, and they also create systems of reward so that poor people, right, so that poor people will obey, right, and also will believe that, death is not the end and they don't have to live in terror of death, right? This also echoes the philosophy of Nietzsche, right? When he talks about slave versus master morality. Nietzsche suggests that most of the morality, right, of quote-unquote slave morality is the idea of self-sacrifice rather than self-assertion. Right? He calls that slave morality, right? Giving to the whole, looking out for the group rather than for the self. And Nietzsche instead, he wants to advocate this thing called master morality, which master morality is something that he would kind of compare to the Greek heroes, right? The Greek heroes, like, for example, Achilles, who would, he would seek to do his own will, what he wanted to do, not what other people wanted them to do. The idea of a lot of the Greek heroes was, like particularly Achilles, who Nietzsche likes to write about, is they know they only have one life to live. And rather than serving the interests or the happiness of anyone else, they were going to do what they wanted to do. And so Achilles, fought for honor and glory for himself, not for anyone else. The basic idea is that Nietzsche has this view of morality that says, if this life is really all we have, again, this materialist viewpoint, why should we live it for these fantasy ideas? Why should we live for religion, which is false, for belief in heaven, which is false, for belief in good and evil? That's why his morality is called beyond good and evil, right? Instead, we should live in such a way in which we should be able to respect ourselves, right? Right? The morality of Nietzsche is all about self-respect, right? Creating your own identity and creating your own code by which to live by. So basically, the critique of Wolf Larsen is that he's suggesting that everything that Maud and Hump do in their morality is based upon the hope of heaven and the belief in goodness, which covers up their own fear of death, right? That's kind of his critique. And that, instead, people should live morality according to not giving in to just sentimentality and emotions, that's Schopenhauer, not giving in to beliefs about heaven, right? False illusions, that's Freud, and also living in a way that's not about, living like slaves to a society, but living to honor oneself and seek one's own desires. That's Friedrich Nietzsche. These are all the kind of things that Wolf Larsen is kind of suggesting, right? And this becomes important because one of the more famous things that is said in wartime is there's this phrase called "there are no atheists in foxholes." Right? The phrase "no atheists in foxholes" means that when someone's in a foxhole, like a trench in the middle of a war, then they're usually no atheists because everyone turns to God and starts praying because they're afraid of death. Wolf Larsen is actually the opposite of that in the coming chapter. So after having this discussion about morality and sentimentality, all of these kind of philosophical ideas began being put to the test in chapter 25. The long and the short of it in chapter 25 is there's a sea battle between the crew of the Ghost and the crew of the Macedonia. The Macedonia being the steamship that is captained by Wolf Larsen's brother, Death Larsen, right? And that's a pretty significant battle. And in that battle, Wolf Larsen actually manages to capture a number of the hunters and a number of the small hunting boats that belong to the Macedonia. He does this pretty cleverly, and it's pretty simple how he does it. The thing is that sealing boats, even though they can be pretty big, and the Macedonia is a massive steamship, they can't use the actual main boat to do their hunting with. The reason for that is you can't shoot a seal from far away and then try to go get it, right? Because it will sink, and you can't. You have to be able to get the seal before it goes too deep into the water. That's why they say they don't shoot seals with rifles. They tend to either club them up close, or they tend to shoot them with something a little bit closer, like a shotgun or a scatter gun, so that there's something that they can get to the seal before it sinks, right? So because of that, they're able to take advantage of the Macedonia's smaller boats, right? The smaller boats that go out to hunt the seals, right? They talk about how the Macedonian sea boats are hogging, right? Hogging, right, is this phrase, pigs in a trough, they don't tend to move, right? If they are in front of the trough, they don't let another animal come and take its place in front of the trough. So that's where hogging means being selfish, staying in an area and protecting it so that you can eat it all by yourself. That's what hogging means. That's what the Macedonians' small boats have been doing. So Wolf Larsen uses the fact that he knows those hunters aren't using their rifles, and he takes them by surprise using rifles, which can fire accurately at a much longer distance, and then proceeds to kidnap a great deal number of the seamen of the hunters of the Macedonia, and taking the sealing boats for his own, because the Macedonia may be a bigger ship, but without those little sealing boats and the hunters and the crew to operate them, Death Larsen is basically out of luck. So that's the major thing that's going on in the plot. But in the middle of this sea gun battle, there's this discussion between Wolf Larsen and Humphrey about who is braver. Humphrey is the one who is brave, right? But it is Wolf Larsen who is fearless. Because you have to remember, if Humphrey is the one who values his life and doesn't want to lose his life, and Wolf Larsen is the one who doesn't feel that life is a very valuable thing, remember he just says life is just kind of a mess, yeast eating yeast, dog eat dog. He points out that Larsen may be without fear in this gun battle, but because he also doesn't feel like he has anything to lose, it's actually Humphrey who's the one who is more brave, which is an interesting dichotomy when you look at the way this battle is going. The interesting thing is, normally someone who's a materialist and an atheist, they're normally someone who, if they think this life is all they have, usually the way that kind of a character is written, they tend to be more cowardly. They tend to run away from battle because they don't want to risk losing their lives. In this case, Wolf Larsen defies the typical character trope, and even though he doesn't believe in life after death, he's still completely fearless in the sea battle, and even starts the sea battle, right? This is, again, the indication of Wolf Larsen as the Nietzschean Superman, right? Basically, right, Wolf Larsen is either going to, he is going to live heroically for himself, right? This is his sense of beauty. This is his sense of honor. He's not fighting for justice or for truth. He's fighting for himself, and he is going to risk everything in the pursuit of what he wants. The world is just a contest of desire, and he believes that his will, right, his will that he can impose is stronger. And if he dies, so what? What does he lose, right? Unlike the trope of often portraying someone who doesn't believe in the afterlife as being more scared, Wolf Larsen, like a heroic character like Achilles of old, he is going to just try his best, risk everything, go for it, and if he fails, he fails. But he is determined to live life to the fullness of what he believes life is. And according to someone like Wolf Larsen, right, life is struggle. And the beauty of life is in the fight. And therefore, if he is going to go down, he is determined to go down fighting, because that is what his essence is. That is how ethically Wolf Larsen, even though he doesn't believe in morality, ethically this is how he remains true to himself.